Today I continue with Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah 17. And this is one before the last Mishnayot of chapter 1. Shimon beno Omer. Shimon beno Omer was understood in the simple meaning of the Mishnah. Most interpreters say it's the son of Rabbi Gamliel, who was mentioned last time. However, it is possible that Shimon beno is referring to the son of Hillel, which was skipped out before Rabban Gamliel, because Rabban Gamliel was the grandson. But as I said, most Mefarshim say that Shimon beno is the son of Shimon ben Gamliel, is the son of Gamliel, so he's Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin. He's at this point not called Ramban, because I guess Rabban, because at this point he wasn't well known at the time of the statement of this Mishnah. That's according to this interpretation. And he lives during the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. In fact, I mentioned last time there's an opinion that he was actually killed during the destruction of the Second Temple in an inner fight between the Zealots and, I guess, himself. And then, of course, this thought makes you reflect on the position or the circumstances of what he is saying here. So Shimon says, Kol yamai gadalti ben chachamim, all of my lifetime I grew up among sages. Because remember, he's from the house of Hillel. His father is a president of the Sanhedrin. He's the president of the Sanhedrin. His son will be a president of the Sanhedrin, but together with Yochanan ben Zakkai, because remember, Yochanan ben Zakkai basically saves not only the world of Torah, but he also saves actually the Gamliel family. That was one of the things that he asked for, as we mentioned last week. So I grew up among sages. I grew up in a rabbinic family, which is an interesting way, by the way. It's an interesting introduction. Why say this? I mean, why state the obvious? What are you trying to say? It says, "V'lo matzati laguf tov ela shtika," and the best thing I found for the body is just keeping silent. What does this mean? Is he just talking about the advantage of keeping silent? And what does it mean for the body? What does it have to do with your body keeping silent? Of course, the Maharal of Prague already says that what he's referring to is not paying attention too much to material things, to bodily things. Keeping silent about the body, meaning not silence in general, but there's certain things you don't have to put bodily issues and material things in the forefront. If you, as it's said in other places, a person who leaves the life of Torah gets the life of Derech Eretz. But if you immerse yourself in the life of Torah, then even a livelihood will come easily. So if you immerse yourself in Torah, you don't have to spend that much time at a livelihood. It'll come easier, and therefore things that have to do with bodily issues or material issues, you should be more silent about them, not make them the focus. That's one way of understanding it. Another way of understanding it, of course, is in light of the circumstances of his life living through the destruction. Remember, when you have arguments and splinter groups among the Jews and factions of what to do with the Romans and how to save Jerusalem. On the one hand, you have the Zealots who want to fight at any cost. On the other hand, you have those who say there's no point. Later on, among Yochanan ben Zakkai, that will be his argument. At this point, there's no point. We can't win the war anyhow. So when you have these arguments, it creates infighting. When there is infighting, it creates civil war. So possibly his statement, when it comes to ourselves, sometimes it's better to keep silent if you want to keep away from bodily harm. Because when there is division from within, then the arguments just push people over the edge and create factionism and create inner violence because they don't know who the enemy is anymore. The enemy is the Romans, but against the Romans, they don't know what to do, so they fight among themselves. So there are certain points in time when stating your opinion too loud is not the greatest thing to do. It just creates more factionalism, and it can actually push things to a point of civil war, and then the only one who wins is the enemy. As we all know, when a couple gets into a bitter divorce, the only one who wins is the attorney who makes all the money, the attorney for the man and the attorney for the woman. But they win nothing from it. So when there is factionalism, when there are infights, when you have very strong dichotomous opinions, be careful because not everything you're going to say is going to help. Because when people get too hot-headed and when they're pushed to an extreme, they lose their focus and they fight who they appears to be the enemy but really is not. And this is in many things. We are experiencing it around the world. Factionalism, we're just a few days from the elections in the United States, which unfortunately has turned into unnecessary factionalism, which we hope will calm down after the elections. Here in Israel, too, certain elements feel that they must keep pushing their points and keep pushing their points and keep pushing their points. Sometimes, even when you're justified, it's not worth keeping pushing your points. Because a unified people is important. A unified people doesn't mean, by the way, that you have to pretend you don't have a different opinion. It's legitimate to have a different opinion, but certain things have to be done, sometimes to unify from within. I wrote about this just a few days ago in the Jerusalem Post, that we need also non-political people to act as unifiers during times of division. Not because the divisions don't exist, because sometimes we have to remind ourselves that the elements that unite us are greater than the divisive elements. So this is another possible explanation of Shimon ben Gamliel looking at the factionism during the destruction of the Second Temple and saying that sometimes it's better to keep silent even if you think you are right, because it could create bodily harm, laguf tov, meaning people start fighting infight and then nobody wins. When there's civil war, nobody wins. That has been our experience when the tribes of the northern kingdom and the tribes of the southern kingdom broke into two. Sometimes they would fight, but actually most of the time they would not. They were actually smart enough not to do that. But because there was dissent and they broke up into two, the northern tribes were destroyed by Sancheriv, whereas the south was not. Yehuda was able to keep itself together, even though it was lesser than the northern tribes. A third way of understanding this statement of "I have not found for the body good except for silence" is just a general statement that sometimes silence is good. The Talmud says on the verse, Hasketu Shema Yisrael, listen, O Israel, like prepare yourself and listen, that the word hasket is two words. Has, which means keep silent, and then chop things up. Meaning, well, if you want to study correctly, first you have to be quiet, you have to be silent, you have to take things in, and then you can discuss. There are a lot of people that like to discuss before they know anything. First you have to know something. And you know something by absorbing. You know something by being silent and listening. And when you listen, even if you have your own opinions, they will germinate and they will grow and they will mature in the interface with other opinions that you hear, because that's how you learn. Has v'achar katet. First be silent and then analyze and chop things up and try to understand the other opinions too. So there is a certain greatness about silence. And very often real scholars stay silent. If they are forced, they will talk. But they're not the first ones to jump in usually. It's not that they don't have what to say, but they observe. And sometimes, if they feel that what they have to say is not being listened to, they don't say it. So the fact that a person is silent is not necessarily testimony to the fact that they don't know what to say when it comes to a scholar. However, it's true that in Proverbs it says, "Gam evil ki yacharish chacham yachashev," that even the ignoramus, when they are silent, people think that they're wise because they didn't say anything. But as soon as they open their mouth, so yes, when you're silent, it's hard to tell the difference between the scholar or the chacham, the wise person, and the ignoramus. But when they open their mouths, then you'll find it out. You will find out the difference. So there definitely is a value to silence, according to this understanding, in learning the process of learning itself. That's statement number one, which we interpreted in three ways. Statement number two, Velo hamidrash ikar ela hamaaseh. It is not study, which is the main thing, but action. Here, the word midrash is a type of study which means analytical study. Analyzing the literature is not the main thing, it's keeping the literature. Now, there's actually an argument in the Talmud whether the study of Torah, and there the term is used as Talmud, not Midrash. Of course, you might say in this context it could be the same. And this is taken from Kiddushin, the Talmud tractate Kiddushin, in the Bavli 40b. And it says, Rabbi Tarfon and the Zikenim, the elderly, were sitting in Beit Nidza in the city of Lud. And they asked the question, or the question was asked before them. Rabbi Tarfon, of course, and Rabbi Akiba, this is 2nd century. Talmud Gadol or Maaseh Gadol, which is greater? Is studying Torah greater or keeping the Torah greater? So Rabbi Tarfon answered and said, of course, action is the greatest. Because why do you study? In order to keep the mitzvot. Rabbi Akiba answered differently. He says, no, the study is greater. So we have different opinions. What is the greatest part? Is it studying the Torah or acting out the Torah? Now, Rabbi Akiva is not denying that you have to act out the Torah. The only question is, what qualitatively is the greater moment, the study or the action? And then finally it says, Nanu Kulam, which means everybody. Now, everybody, I guess, would also be Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, or maybe all the sages in the room, and said, Talmud Gadol, study is greater because study brings you to deed. Now, that seems a little puzzling. To say that study is greater because it brings you to deed, it sounds like the deed or the action is greater. So it's a little bit puzzling answer. You have one says that study is greater, another says the action is greater, the deed, and then everybody says, well, study is greater because it brings towards the deed. So which one really is greater? So the first thing to be understood from this is, when you study Torah, it has to focus on the outcome. When you study Talmud, this is also the opinion of the Vilna Gaon and his student Chaim Volozhin, and later on Rabbi Kook, who was, of course, a student of the Volozhin Yeshiva, that when you study Torah, you have to have in mind what will be the actual outcome, what we call the halacha. You have to focus on the end result in order to understand the process correctly. So studying Talmud at the source level is important focus to understand how the process brings you to the action. It's just the way that you study Torah. This is one thing to understand from this. And then, of course, the study is greater in the sense that you now understand much better what the action is supposed to be. So here again, we can say, Lo midrash yikar ela maaseh. It's not the study that is great, that is the main part, but the action. But the study is a qualitative time which will be greater because it is going to perfect your action. It'll perfect your understanding of the action. So even if the study is in order to get to the action, but the study will transform the deed into something else. Because remember, a human being is not just a body, you're also the intellect and the mind. And when the mind is focused and understands, then the action is qualitatively greater. The truth is that the Talmud also feels that the study of Torah is a certain instance, which is the greatest moment. Gadol, it says about the Talmud Torah keneged kulam. There's something about the mitzvah of studying Torah, which is qualitatively greater than all the mitzvah. So there are two aspects here. The study of Torah in relationship to deed is going to transform the deed. But there is also the mitzvah of studying Torah, which is a mitzvah by itself, is a certain relationship to God, which can transcend the relationship through the mitzvah, through the deed. This is talked about a lot in Chaim Volozhin's Nefesh HaChaim. Lo midrashi kara l'maaseh. So here we're saying that the deed is greater, but yes, the deed can be transformed through the study. The deed is greater in the sense that it's the main purpose of the study, but there is also a mitzvah of study Torah, which he's actually, in my opinion, not discussing here. But he's discussing of the relationship of every mitzvah to its source. And when you talk too much, this is going back to part 1 about silence, sometimes talking too much just brings to sin. There's certain things that are better unsaid. As Menachem Mendel Mikotsk once said, not everything you think do you have to say, not everything you say do you have to write down and publish. So sometimes talking too much is not good, especially because people have the ability to misunderstand. In fact, people can easily misunderstand when they don't understand you. And then they take it out of context in broken telephone. Kol marbed dvarim, but marbed dvarim sounds like if you talk too much. Because in general, when people talk too much, they also make jokes, sarcasm, and it's good sometimes to weigh what you say. And again, this can be understood in the sense of the circumstances in which he is saying them, the divisionism within the Jewish people, the Romans who have a siege around Jerusalem at the moment. And sometimes, so it's better to keep your words few and to think about them and to weigh them before you say this. So all of Shimon's words now have to do with, in that sense, could be understood in the circumstances where he is living. So I lived among scholars, you could say. Now I'm living among factions. Right? There's a certain qualitative edge to silence. And in general, deeds are enhanced by study, but deeds are important. And talking too much could be a problem even by itself. So even though there is meaning to Shimon ben Gamliel's statement by itself, in the study of Torah and the understanding of the importance of mitzvah, in the relationship to students, that sometimes talking too much is not always advantageous, but it can also be understood, as I said, in the circumstances of the factionalism on the brink of the destruction of the Second Temple, which is the world in which he lives at the time that these things are being said. So next week we have the last Mishnah of chapter 1, Shimon ben Gamliel, which is again his grandson. And in it, he will try to summarize the whole chapter on 3 things, just like it started off on 3 things of Shimon HaTzadik. It'll be summarized in three things as well. In the meantime, I wish everyone shalom, shalom.